My name is Melissa Ainsley. I'm 36 years old, and 14 months ago, my mother called to tell me it would be better for everyone if I didn't come to my younger sister's wedding, 4 months after I'd warned my parents, at their own kitchen table, that refinancing their paid-off house to help fund it was a mistake. What none of them knew was that the warning I gave that night wasn't going to just sit there, unheeded, forever. It was going to come due, with interest, in a conversation I never expected to have, one where a stranger with a clipboard and a federal mandate was going to say, calmly and factually, exactly what my family had spent over a year pretending hadn't happened. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been punished for being right too early, comment, "I've been there," below. This one's for you. I've worked in marketing for 12 years, the last 5 as a senior manager at a mid-sized tech company, and if there's one professional skill that's bled into my personal life more than any other, it's a fairly relentless comfort with spreadsheets. I track my own finances the way some people track their fitness, monthly, honestly, without flinching from the numbers. I bought my condo outright with a down payment I'd saved for 6 years. I'm not a cold person, whatever my family might tell you now. I just believe that loving someone sometimes means telling them something they don't want to hear, and I learned, the hard way, that my family didn't actually want that kind of love from me, not when it came with math attached. I didn't develop this relationship with money in a vacuum. I remember, at 22, fresh out of college and working my first real job, watching my parents quietly absorb a $6,000 credit card balance Sarah had run up on clothes and concert tickets, without ever once sitting her down to talk about budgeting. I asked my mother, gently, if that felt sustainable, and she told me, a little sharply, that Sarah was still finding her footing and that I shouldn't worry about things that weren't my business. I took the hint. I started keeping my own finances meticulously organized, in part, I think now, as a quiet rebellion against a household where financial conversations only seemed to happen after something had already gone wrong. Early in my career, a mentor at my first marketing job, a woman named Patricia who ran the department, told me something during a routine check-in that I've carried ever since. The people who ask you for money with the most confidence are often the ones who've never had to sit with the consequences of not having it. Don't confuse their confidence for financial wisdom. I didn't fully understand what she meant at 24. I understood it much more clearly, years later, watching my family's wedding budget climb past 6 figures with an ease that seemed to come from nowhere, but somehow, eventually, always landed somewhere real. My sister Sarah is 29, 7 years younger than me, warm and funny, and the undisputed favorite in a way our parents have never fully bothered to hide. She's also had a complicated relationship with money for most of her adult life, credit card debt in her early 20s that my parents quietly paid off, a car loan they co-signed and then largely covered themselves after 2 missed payments, a pattern I watched from a slight distance for years, never quite my business to comment on until it started to involve numbers large enough to worry me. I want to say clearly that Sarah and I were close once, in a way that makes all of this harder to sit with rather than easier. When she was in high school and I was already living on my own, she used to call me most Sunday nights just to talk. About friends, about a boy she liked, about nothing important at all. I loved those calls. I think some part of the ache I felt during the wedding ban wasn't really about the wedding itself. It was about watching a closeness I genuinely valued get quietly overwritten by a family narrative that cast me as the difficult one, without either of us ever really choosing that shift directly. There's a particular thing Sarah and I never discussed directly, even before all of this, that our parents' generosity toward her and their reticence toward me had shaped how each of us learned to ask for help in the world. Sarah asks easily, expects support as a kind of default. I learned early that asking risked disappointment, so I stopped asking at all and built a life that mostly didn't require it. I don't think either approach is inherently healthier. I do think growing up on opposite sides of that particular coin explains more about how we each handled money, and each other, than either of us fully understood until this whole situation forced us to. My parents, Carol and Dennis, are both retired now. Dennis from 30 years managing a regional distribution warehouse, Carol from a long career as a school administrator. They're generous people, genuinely, and I don't think either of them would describe themselves as playing favorites. But love, in my family, has always come with an asterisk for Sarah that it never came with for me. A softness in how her mistakes got handled, a rigidity in how mine were expected to be handled myself, without help, because I'd apparently always been the strong one. I've thought a lot about where my parents' particular blind spot with Sarah actually came from. My mother has mentioned, a few times over the years, that her own younger sister died young, in her 20s, before their relationship had fully settled into adulthood. An old grief, I think, shaped, in ways my mother has never fully examined out loud, an anxious, almost superstitious instinct to give Sarah whatever she wanted, as if withholding anything from a younger daughter might somehow be tempting fate. I don't offer this as an excuse. I offer it because understanding where the pattern came from has made it easier, over time, to feel compassion for my parents, alongside the very real hurt they caused me. Sarah got engaged to her boyfriend Jason 2 years ago, and almost immediately, the wedding planning took on a scale that worried me before I ever said a word about it. A venue at a vineyard 3 hours away, a guest list approaching 200, a photographer flown in from out of state. I watched the budget balloon in family group texts, watched my parents offer to help however they could, without ever quite specifying a number, and felt a familiar, uneasy tightness building in my chest months before the conversation that would eventually get me banned from the whole thing. I want to mention Jason here, Sarah's fiancé at the time, because he wasn't entirely oblivious to the budget creep either. At an early engagement party, he pulled me aside, half joking, and said, "Your sister has very expensive taste and very little patience for spreadsheets. You should know that going in." I laughed at the time, not realizing how prophetic the comment would turn out to be. I think Jason genuinely loved Sarah and genuinely didn't know how to say no to her either, which meant the two people planning that wedding were, between them, entirely unequipped to notice the budget sliding out of control until it already had. About 3 months before the ban, I actually built a full wedding budget spreadsheet on my own time, unprompted, after noticing the numbers climbing in the family group chat, and sent it to my mother with a short note offering to walk her through it if it would help. She never responded to the email directly. 2 weeks later, at a different family gathering, she mentioned, almost dismissively, that she'd seen my spreadsheet thing, but that Sarah has her heart set on certain things, and some costs just aren't negotiable. I didn't push. I filed the exchange away as one more small, deniable moment in a pattern I was only beginning to fully see. 4 months before the wedding, at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house, my father mentioned, almost in passing, that he and my mother were looking into refinancing the house, paid off for 11 years, to help cover the remaining wedding costs, which by then had crept past $70,000. I didn't respond right away. I want to be honest that I sat with it for a full minute, doing the math in my head, before I finally said, "Dad, that's a real risk. You're both retired on a fixed income. If anything changes, that's not a small mistake to walk back." I want to be precise about what I said that night, because in the months since, my parents' account of it has softened into something closer to "Melissa lectured us," which isn't quite accurate. After raising the risk, I offered, immediately, to sit down with them and Sarah and help build a leaner budget that could still feel special without the refinance. I even offered to research vendors, to help negotiate a smaller guest list tactfully, to contribute what I reasonably could myself toward specific line items. Nobody took me up on any of it. I think, looking back, the offer of help was almost more unwelcome than the warning itself, because it would have required admitting, out loud, that the plan needed adjusting. My mother's face changed almost instantly. "We didn't ask for a financial lecture, Melissa. We asked if you wanted more potatoes," Sarah, sitting across from me, said, quieter but sharper. "It's my wedding. Why does it always have to become about your opinions on money?" I tried, gently, to explain that I wasn't trying to ruin anything, that I just didn't want them to end up in a situation they couldn't get out of. Nobody at that table wanted to hear it. My father changed the subject to the weather, and the rest of the dinner passed in a strained, overly polite silence I recognized as the sound of a door quietly closing. I remember the drive home from that dinner more clearly than almost anything else in this story. 40 minutes of quiet, replaying the conversation, trying to figure out which specific word or sentence had turned a reasonable concern into an unforgivable offense. I called Derek from the car, and he listened to the whole thing before saying, carefully, "It sounds like you said something true and inconvenient, and they didn't have a way to hold both of those at once." I didn't fully understand what he meant until much later. At the time, I just cried the rest of the way home, embarrassed by how much a single dinner had managed to unravel me. I started seeing a therapist a few months into the estrangement, mostly to process the grief of it, and I remember describing that dinner to her in detail during an early session. She asked me a question that reframed the whole night for me. Do you think your family has room in its emotional vocabulary for a concern delivered without an accompanying apology for having it? I sat with that for a long time. I realized I'd apologized, reflexively, for raising the point almost as I raised it, softening it, hedging it, and it still hadn't been received as anything other than an attack. That told me something important. The problem was never really about tone. It was about the content itself being unwelcome, no matter how carefully I delivered it. Months after everything had resolved, Sarah showed me, almost sheepishly, a text she'd sent to a friend the week of that original dinner. A screenshot she'd kept for reasons she couldn't fully explain. It read, "My sister said something at dinner tonight about the wedding budget, and honestly, she might be right, but I can't deal with that right now. Everyone's just going to have to get over it." Seeing it, over a year later, was strange. Proof that some part of Sarah had known, in real time, that my concern held weight, even as the family closed ranks around a different, more comfortable version of events. She apologized again when she showed it to me. I told her she didn't need to, that the text itself, and her willingness to finally share it, said more than any apology could. I didn't bring it up again after that dinner, though it sat with me constantly. I noticed, over the following weeks, a coolness in the family group chat that hadn't been there before, replies to my messages arriving slower, wedding planning discussions happening, I suspected, in a separate thread I wasn't part of. I told myself I was imagining it. I've since learned I wasn't. I drafted a long, careful text to Sarah during those weeks, trying to explain that my concern about the money had never been about her, that I just wanted the day and everything after it to go well for her. I typed and deleted it 3 separate times, worried it would read as one more lecture rather than the apology-adjacent olive branch I meant it to be. I never sent it. I've wondered since whether things might have gone differently if I had, though I've also come to accept that I can't fully know that, and holding on to that particular regret too tightly hasn't served me especially well. 4 months before the wedding, exactly, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carefully measured in a way I recognized as rehearsed. "Melissa, I've been thinking, and I think it might be better for everyone, for the day to go smoothly, for Sarah not to feel any tension, if you sat this one out." I asked her, stunned, if she was seriously suggesting I not come to my own sister's wedding. She said, "It's not permanent. We just don't want any negativity around the money stuff. You understand." I want to describe something specific about my mother's tone on that call, because I've replayed it many times since. Underneath the rehearsed calm, there was a strain I recognized, the particular sound of someone repeating words that weren't originally theirs. I asked her, directly, "Did you and Dad decide this together, or is this coming from somewhere else?" She paused a beat too long before answering, "It's a family decision," which wasn't really an answer at all. I've wondered since whether Sarah had pushed harder for this than either of my parents initially wanted, and whether my mother's discomfort on that call was the sound of a decision she didn't fully agree with but wasn't willing to override. I didn't yell. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to, and didn't, because I'd spent my whole life being the calm one in this family, and old habits held even then. I asked her, quietly, if she understood what she was actually asking, that I stay away from my only sister's wedding because I'd once, gently, questioned a financial decision. She didn't answer that directly. She said, "We'll send you pictures," as if that settled something. I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. The same kitchen floor I'd sat on years earlier crying happy tears when I'd closed on the condo, now crying a very different kind of tears entirely. My father called an hour after my mother hung up, and I remember hoping, for a brief moment, that he was calling to reverse the decision. He wasn't. He said, awkwardly, "Your mother and I talked about it together. This isn't just her. We think it's for the best." I asked him directly if he actually believed that, or if he was just agreeing with her to keep the peace. There was a long pause before he said, "I don't know anymore. Honestly, I just want the day to go smoothly for Sarah." It was, in its own quiet way, more honest than anything my mother had said, and somehow that honesty made it hurt even more. There's a question I've never actually asked my mother directly, even after everything that came later, and I think about it often. I never asked her whether Sarah herself had specifically requested that I be excluded, or whether that decision had come entirely from my parents, filtered through their own anxiety about keeping the peace. I've told myself I don't need to know the answer, that it wouldn't change how any of it felt. I'm not sure that's entirely true. Some part of me has simply decided it's safer not to ask, in case the answer is one I'm not ready to carry alongside everything else this story already holds. My closest friend, Elena Brooks, has known my family for almost 15 years, long enough to have her own clear-eyed read on the dynamic. When I told her what had happened, she didn't sugarcoat it. "They didn't ban you for causing tension, Melissa. They banned you because you were right, and having you in the room on the actual day would have meant sitting with that." I told her that felt like an uncharitable read. She said, "Maybe, but ask yourself honestly, if you'd agreed the refinance was a great idea that night, would you still be uninvited?" I didn't have a good answer. Elena told me something that day I hadn't known about her own family, that she'd been excluded from a cousin's wedding years earlier for a similarly murky reason, something she'd never fully gotten a straight answer about even now. "The thing that helped me most," she said, "was accepting that I might never get a clean explanation, and deciding I didn't need one to know my own version of events was valid." I told her I wasn't sure I was ready to let go of wanting an explanation. She said that was fair too, that there wasn't a required timeline for any of it. My partner, Derek, has been with me for 6 years, and he watched this entire saga unfold with a kind of quiet, controlled fury he rarely shows about anything. The week of the wedding, he found me looking at Sarah's Instagram photos from the rehearsal dinner and said, gently, "You don't have to keep torturing yourself with this. You're allowed to just be sad about it, without also watching it happen in real time." He was right. I closed the app and didn't open it again for weeks. Derek offered, more than once in those months, to say something to my parents directly himself, on my behalf. I asked him not to, worried it would only escalate things further and put him in an awkward position with people he still had to see at future holidays. He respected that, though I could tell it cost him something to stay quiet while watching me hurt. "I'm not going to pretend I understand how they justified this," he told me once. "But I trust you to handle your own family in your own time. I'm just here." It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was, in its steadiness, exactly what I needed most. Derek's mother, who I'd grown close to over the years, called me not long after the ban, having heard a vague version through Derek. She didn't offer advice exactly. She just told me about a rift she'd once had with her own sister, decades earlier, over something that felt enormous at the time, and now, she admitted, she could barely fully reconstruct the details of. "Time does something to these things," she said. "Not always fairly, but it does soften the edges enough that reconciliation usually becomes possible again, if both people are willing when the moment comes." I didn't know, at the time, how literally that reassurance would turn out to apply to my own situation. I spent Sarah's wedding day at home, in sweatpants, having sent a gift from her registry 2 weeks earlier, a set of cookware neither of them acknowledged receiving until almost a month later, a small, telling detail I noticed and didn't mention to anyone. Derek made me dinner that night and didn't ask me to talk about it if I didn't want to. I mostly didn't. I remember lying awake that night, wondering how a wedding I'd known every detail of for a year, the venue, the flowers, the seating chart, had become an event I'd only experienced secondhand, through photos other people posted. I want to be honest that I checked social media that day, more than once, despite telling myself I wouldn't. I saw a photo of my parents posing with Sarah and Jason near the vineyard's stone archway, all of them beaming, captioned by a family friend as, "Such a beautiful day surrounded by everyone who matters most." I don't think whoever wrote that caption knew what they were actually saying, or how precisely it would land on the one person conspicuously absent from every photo. I closed the app after that one and didn't look again for the rest of the day. My grandmother on my father's side, Eleanor, called me the week of the wedding, unaware of any of the ban. She'd assumed, reasonably, that I simply hadn't been able to get time off work. I didn't correct her. Something about explaining the actual situation to an 86-year-old who still sent me birthday cards with $2 bills tucked inside felt like more than I could manage that week. We talked instead about her garden, about a neighbor's new puppy, ordinary things that asked nothing of me. I hung up, grateful for 30 minutes where I hadn't had to think about the vineyard 3 hours away at all. The months after the wedding were quiet, in a specific, deliberate way. My mother texted occasionally, brief and cheerful, as if nothing unusual had happened. Sarah and I exchanged a handful of surface-level messages, nothing about the wedding itself, nothing about the fact that I hadn't been there. I told myself I was moving on. I mostly wasn't. I was simply getting quieter about how much it still hurt, which isn't the same thing, though it took me a while to understand the difference. My Aunt Diane, my mother's older sister, called me a few weeks after the wedding, having apparently heard a vague version of events through the family grapevine. She didn't press me for details. She just said, "I don't know exactly what happened, but I know you, and I know you wouldn't have missed that day without a real reason. I'm sorry, whatever it was." It was such a small gesture, and it meant more to me than almost anything else in those early months. Someone in the family extending basic trust in my judgment, without needing the whole story first. I threw myself into work during those first few months, in a way my manager actually commented on, gently, in a one-on-one, noting that I'd taken on more than my usual share of projects and asking if everything was okay at home. I told her, honestly, that things were complicated with my family, and left it at that. She didn't push. I've since come to recognize that stretch as a fairly textbook case of channeling grief into productivity, a coping strategy that worked well enough to get me through the days, though it did little to actually process what I was avoiding feeling. Around month 6, my mother mentioned, in an unrelated conversation, that the refinance had gone through fine and that they were managing it comfortably. I remember feeling a small, uneasy relief at that, glad, despite everything, that my warning hadn't come true. I didn't yet know that the terms of that refinance included an adjustable rate that would reset after 12 months, a detail my parents either hadn't fully understood or had chosen not to mention to anyone, including, it would turn out, themselves. I sent Sarah a small gift around her first wedding anniversary, a photo frame, deliberately neutral, not quite sure what tone to strike after a year of near silence between us. She texted back a simple "thank you," nothing more, and I remember staring at that brief message for a long time, trying to read meaning into 3 words that probably didn't hold as much weight as I was giving them. I didn't know yet that within a matter of weeks, the surface calm of that year was about to break open entirely, in a way none of us had seen coming. 14 months after the wedding, almost to the week, my mother called again. A different kind of call entirely, her voice thin and shaking in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Melissa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." I sat down slowly, already sensing where this was going. "The mortgage payment went up. A lot. We're behind. We're hoping you might be able to help us with $45,000, just until we can refinance again." I want to describe, honestly, the very first emotion that moved through me before anything else that night. Not anger, not vindication, but a strange, disorienting worry for my parents' safety and stability, the same instinct I'd have had before any of this happened. It took a few seconds for the rest of it to catch up. The memory of the kitchen table, the phone call 14 months earlier, the vineyard photos I'd made myself stop looking at. Both things were true at once. I was afraid for my parents, and I was also, quietly, furious that it had taken a crisis this large to bring them back to my door. I want to give the full shape of that phone call because there was more to it than the initial ask. After the number came out, my mother kept talking, almost unable to stop, explaining fragments of the situation faster than I could process them. The medical bill, a missed statement, a certified letter from the servicer she hadn't opened for 2 weeks because she was afraid of what it said. I finally interrupted, gently, and told her to slow down, that I needed her to send me the actual documents before we talked about numbers at all. She agreed immediately, relieved, I think, to have a concrete next step instead of just her own spiraling account of it. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I want to be honest about what I felt in that silence. Not triumph, not the satisfaction of having been right, but something closer to grief, layered over an old, familiar hurt I hadn't finished healing from. I finally said, I need to understand exactly what happened before I can even think about that. My mother's voice cracked. I know we owe you an explanation. I didn't know who else to call. I called Derek immediately after hanging up with my mother, still sitting on the same kitchen floor where I'd once cried after being told not to come to the wedding. He listened to the whole thing, quiet and careful, and then asked, "What do you actually want to do here?" I told him I honestly didn't know. That part of me wanted to say no immediately, and part of me couldn't stomach the idea of my parents losing their house over a decision I'd warned them against. He didn't try to talk me into either direction. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I think you should get the full picture first, from someone who isn't emotionally involved in any of it." That suggestion, more than anything else, was what led me to insist on the counseling process before agreeing to anything. My mother emailed me a stack of scanned documents 2 days later, and I spent an evening going through them alone before the family meeting, trying to understand the numbers on my own terms before I had to sit across from anyone. I recognized, reading the original refinance disclosure, exactly the kind of adjustable rate structure I'd vaguely warned about at that dinner over a year earlier, laid out now in black and white, dates and percentages that had been abstract warnings back then, and were now simply, unavoidably, math. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt a specific, heavy sadness, the particular grief of watching a fear you'd tried to prevent turn out to be exactly, precisely accurate. We met at my parents' kitchen table the following weekend. My parents, Sarah, Jason, and me, the same table where I'd first raised my concerns 14 months earlier. My father explained, haltingly, that the rate had reset far higher than they'd expected, that a medical expense of my mother's earlier in the year had eaten into their reserve, and that they simply didn't have the cushion to absorb both. Sarah sat quietly through most of it, pale, clearly hearing some of these details for the first time herself. I want to describe what it felt like, physically, walking back into my parents' house for that meeting, the first time I'd been inside since the dinner that started all of this, the same kitchen table, the same chair I'd been sitting in when I first raised my concerns. Nothing about the room had changed, and yet everything about what it meant to sit at that table had. I noticed my hands were shaking slightly as I set down my bag, and I remember thinking, distantly, that no amount of professional composure at work had prepared me for how much this particular room could still undo me. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for almost 10 minutes before going in for that family meeting, running through everything I wanted to say, and everything I'd promised myself I wouldn't. I told myself, specifically, that I wasn't walking in there to win an argument or extract an apology. That whatever happened with the numbers, I needed to walk out of that meeting having behaved in a way I could respect afterward, regardless of how anyone else in that kitchen behaved. It was a small, private commitment, but it steadied me enough to finally get out of the car and knock on a door I hadn't walked through in over a year. Because the amount and the type of relief my parents needed, a loan modification through their mortgage servicer, required it, I asked them, before agreeing to anything, to first meet with a HUD-approved housing counselor, a standard, federally mandated step for exactly this kind of assistance. I wasn't trying to set a trap. I genuinely didn't know what we'd learn. The counselor assigned to their case, Renee Castillo, had spent 12 years helping families navigate exactly this situation, entirely unconnected to my family, unaware of any of our history, simply doing the job she did for dozens of families a year. I want to explain why I pushed for the counseling process rather than simply agreeing or refusing outright. Because I think it matters for understanding who I'd become in the 14 months since the wedding. A colleague at work had gone through a similar family lending situation the year before and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that any loan modification request above a certain threshold legally required independent housing counseling before a servicer would even consider it. It wasn't a maneuver on my part. It was simply the correct, unavoidable next step for the kind of help my parents actually needed, and it happened to also be the first time, in this entire saga, that a neutral party would look at the full picture rather than a version filtered through anyone's feelings. Renee sat with all of us, my parents, Sarah, Jason, and me, and walked through the full financial picture with the same calm, unhurried clarity I imagine she brought to every family in that chair. "Your refinance was taken out 14 months ago," she said, looking at the documents. "About $61,000 of it went directly to wedding vendors, based on the disbursement records here. The rate reset was built into the original terms. It's right here in the loan documents you signed." She looked up. "Did you understand, at the time, that the rate would increase this significantly?" My father admitted, quietly, that he hadn't fully understood it, that he'd been more focused on getting the money together in time for the deposits. Renee pulled out a simple spreadsheet partway through the meeting, the kind of document I might have built myself a year earlier if anyone had let me. Income on one side, the new payment on the other, a gap of roughly $780 a month that neither Social Security nor Dennis's small pension could absorb. She walked through it line by line, without judgment, the way a nurse might explain a diagnosis. Not to assign blame, just to make the reality visible to everyone in the room at the same time. I watched my father's face as the numbers came into focus, and understood, for the first time, that some part of him had genuinely not grasped the scale of what he'd signed, that willful blindness and honest confusion had blurred together in a way that made this both more forgivable and more frightening than I'd expected. I want to note one more specific beat from Renee's presentation, because it stayed with me clearly. When she reached the section detailing the exact vendor disbursements, the venue deposit, the florist, the band, my father asked her to pause for a moment and just sat there, hands pressed flat against the table, staring at a specific line item. $8,400 for a string quartet neither he nor my mother had particularly wanted, a detail Sarah had pushed hard for during planning. He didn't say anything critical of Sarah in that moment. He just looked, for a few long seconds, like a man doing math he'd been actively avoiding for over a year, finally allowed nowhere else to look. Sarah went very still during that explanation, and when Renee finished, she turned to my parents and said, "You told me you'd saved for this. You told me it was from your retirement fund." My mother didn't answer right away. My father said quietly, "We didn't want you to feel guilty about the cost. It was supposed to be a gift, not a burden." Sarah looked, in that moment, more hurt than I'd seen her in years. Not at me, for once, but at the two people who'd banned me from her wedding to protect her from exactly the truth that had just been laid bare in front of all of us anyway. Jason, who'd said very little through most of the meeting, finally spoke up near the end, addressing my parents directly. "Did you know this when Melissa raised her concerns at that dinner, before the wedding?" It was the question none of us had asked out loud yet, and the room went quiet waiting for the answer. My father admitted, after a long pause, that he'd already begun the refinance application by that point, that my warning had come, in a sense, too late to change the plan, even if they'd wanted it to, which meant the decision to exclude me hadn't been about protecting the wedding from tension at all. It had been about not wanting a witness to a decision that was already, quietly, beyond reversing. My mother cried, quietly, through most of the rest of that meeting, repeating some version of, "We just wanted it to be perfect for her," several times, as if the sentence alone could undo the math. My father was harder to read, mostly silent, staring at the loan documents like they belonged to someone else's life. At one point he looked at me and said, "You told us this exact thing would happen." I told him I hadn't wanted to be right. I meant it. Renee stepped out briefly to make copies of some paperwork, and in that gap, my mother reached across the table and took my hand, something she hadn't done in over a year. "I think I banned you because some part of me already knew you were right," she said, and I didn't want to spend the whole wedding watching your face and knowing it too. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me since the whole ordeal began, and I didn't have a graceful response to it. I just squeezed her hand back and let the silence hold what neither of us was ready to say out loud yet. My father asked to speak with me alone for a few minutes after Renee left, out on the back porch where we'd had countless ordinary conversations over the years. He didn't apologize eloquently. That's never really been his register. He just said, "I think I let your mother make the call about the wedding because it was easier than arguing with her, and I've regretted it every day since, whether I said so or not." I asked him why he hadn't called me himself, at any point in the 14 months, to say that. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting, "I didn't know how to call you without it turning into asking you for something. I didn't want the first real conversation we had in over a year to be about money." I told him that this conversation, happening as it was already halfway there, might as well finish the job. He almost laughed, despite everything, and it was the first real, unguarded moment between us in a long time. I want to note something about myself in that meeting, because I think it matters for the honesty of this whole account. As Renee walked through the numbers, I noticed I wasn't tempted, even once, to say, "I told you so," despite 14 months of hurt sitting right there in my chest. I don't say this to claim some kind of moral high ground. I think, honestly, the hurt had simply moved past the stage, where saying it out loud would have felt satisfying. What I felt instead was closer to relief. The specific relief of watching a family finally arrive, together, at a truth I'd been carrying alone for over a year. Sarah found me in the kitchen, while Renee finished up paperwork with my parents, and said, without preamble, "I'm sorry. For all of it. I let them tell me you were the problem because it was easier than admitting the wedding had gotten out of control." I told her I appreciated her saying it, and that I understood, at 29, planning her own wedding, she'd wanted to believe the version of events that let her enjoy the day without guilt. She nodded, and for the first time in over a year, we hugged like sisters instead of two people carefully managing a fracture. Sarah told me something else in that kitchen, something I hadn't expected. She said there'd been a moment during the reception, cutting the cake, when she'd looked out at the crowd and realized I wasn't there, and had felt a sharp, sudden wrongness about the whole day that she'd pushed down and never mentioned to anyone. "I told myself it was fine," she said, "because Mom kept saying it was fine." I don't think I actually believed her. Even then, hearing that didn't undo the missed day, but it mattered to know that some part of her had noticed the absence too, rather than accepting the family's careful framing without question. I didn't hand over $45,000 outright. Renee's counseling process, as it turned out, qualified my parents for a formal loan modification that reduced what they actually needed to a more manageable gap, closer to $18,000, which I agreed to loan them directly, at a modest interest rate, with a written repayment schedule Renee herself helped us draft. It wasn't generosity without structure. It was, I think, the first time my family and I had ever handled money together, with complete honesty on the table, rather than assumptions and unspoken resentments. I want to describe the conversation about terms specifically, because I think it mattered as much as the number itself. I told my parents, plainly, that I needed this to be a documented loan, not a gift, with a real repayment schedule, not because I doubted their intentions, but because I needed, for my own sake, for this transaction to look nothing like the informal, undocumented rescues Sarah had received over the years. My father, to his credit, agreed immediately, almost with relief, as if being asked to take the arrangement seriously was its own kind of respect he hadn't expected. Renee helped us draft a simple one-page agreement, and my father signed it at that same kitchen table, his handwriting steadier than I expected it to be. Before she left that day, Renee pulled me aside briefly, professional but clearly perceptive about more than just the numbers. "I don't usually comment on family dynamics," she said, "but for what it's worth, in 12 years of doing this, the families who recover fastest are the ones who get everything out on the table in one sitting, the way yours just did, rather than dragging it out over months of half-truths. That took courage, on everyone's part, including yours for pushing for this meeting in the first place." I thanked her, and meant it. She had no way of knowing how much that small, professional validation meant, coming from someone with absolutely no stake in whether my family healed or didn't. I texted Elena that night, after everyone had gone home, giving her the short version of everything that had happened. She wrote back, "I'm so glad you insisted on the counselor. Not because it proved you right, because it meant your family finally had to look at the actual truth together instead of just at each other's feelings about it." I read that message a few times, sitting alone in my kitchen, and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for over a year. Not closure exactly, but the beginning of something that might eventually become closure, given enough time and enough of exactly this kind of honesty. My parents have made every payment on time in the months since, small but consistent, a specific behavioral change I've come to trust more than any apology could have earned on its own. My mother calls more often now and has started, tentatively, asking my opinion on financial decisions before making them, rather than after. Sarah and I talk weekly, something we hadn't done in years even before the wedding. She invited me, unprompted, to be there for the birth of her first child this spring, and I was, in the room, the way I'd once expected to be, in a much smaller room a year and a half earlier. My parents hosted a Sunday dinner about 4 months after the counseling meeting, the first one I'd attended since the ban, and I remember sitting at that same kitchen table with a strange, careful awareness of how much had changed in that room, without the furniture itself moving an inch. My father brought up a minor home repair decision and asked, directly, what I thought about the cost-benefit of fixing it themselves versus hiring someone. An ordinary question, the kind any family might ask, except that in our family, it was the first time in years anyone had asked my financial opinion about something that didn't already have a crisis attached to it. Derek came to that dinner with me, his first time back in that house since everything had happened, and on the drive home afterward he said, "Your dad asked you 3 separate questions tonight and actually waited for the full answer each time. I don't think I've ever seen that happen before." I hadn't consciously counted, but once he said it, I realized he was right. 3 genuine questions, 3 full answers, no interruptions, no redirect back to safer topics. It was such a small thing to notice. It was also, I think, the clearest evidence I had that something real had shifted, measured not in grand gestures, but in the ordinary rhythm of a Sunday conversation. Sarah told me, a few months after the counseling meeting, that she and Jason had started meeting with a financial advisor themselves, entirely unprompted by anyone in the family, specifically because watching our parents' near miss had frightened her into examining her own habits. "I don't want to be 45 and still learning this lesson the way Mom and Dad are," she told me. It was a strange, quiet kind of vindication, not the satisfaction of having been right about the wedding specifically, but the relief of watching someone I loved actually change course before her own version of the same mistake had a chance to fully form. About 6 months after the counseling meeting, my father sent me a text out of nowhere, unusual for him since he rarely texted unprompted. It read simply, "Made the payment today. Also wanted to say, I've been thinking about that first dinner a lot. You were trying to protect us, and I made it about something else entirely. I'm sorry it took this long to say that plainly." I read it 3 times before responding. I wrote back that I appreciated it more than he probably knew, and that I was proud of how far they'd come. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, delivered in person with tears. It was a text message, sent on an ordinary Tuesday, and somehow that made it land even more than a bigger gesture might have. I've thought a great deal, since that kitchen table meeting, about the specific shape of the mistake my parents made. Not the refinance itself, though that was reckless, but the decision to protect Sarah's happiness by silencing the one person who'd told them the truth, rather than by simply telling Sarah the truth herself. I think families do this more often than we admit. Mistake secrecy for kindness, mistake exclusion for peacekeeping, and end up, eventually, paying for both mistakes at once, with interest. I told Elena the whole story once the dust had settled, start to finish, and she was quiet for a while before saying, "I think what strikes me most is that they didn't ban you to protect Sarah from you. They banned you to protect themselves from having to look at what they already knew, with you in the room as a witness to it." I sat with that for a long moment. It reframed something I'd been turning over for months, that the exclusion had never really been about my behavior at all, but about my parents' own unwillingness to face a decision they'd already half known was a mistake before they made it. I also came to recognize something less flattering about my own role in all of this, something I hadn't fully sat with until months after the counseling meeting. I'd spent years being the family member who managed her own finances carefully and quietly judged, at least a little, the ones who didn't, a stance that felt responsible from the inside, but that I now understand could have come across, to my parents and Sarah, as a kind of unspoken superiority they were reacting to as much as to the actual content of my warnings. That doesn't excuse how they handled it, but it helped me understand, more fully, why my concern that night landed as an attack rather than as the care I genuinely meant it to be, and it's changed, since then, how carefully I try to deliver hard truths to the people I love. If you've ever been the one punished for raising a concern that later turned out to be true, I'd tell you this: being right doesn't need to come with bitterness attached, and it doesn't obligate you to say, "I told you so," once the truth finally surfaces on its own. It's enough to simply hold the boundary you already held. Mine was requiring transparency before offering money, and let the facts do the rest of the talking. I didn't need Renee to vindicate me. I needed her to help my family, and the vindication, when it came, was simply a byproduct of the truth finally having somewhere honest to land. Part 26b. A note for the parent, reading this. And if you're the parent in a situation like this one, if you've ever excluded someone from a family milestone because their honesty felt like an obstacle to the version of the day you wanted, I'd ask you to consider what my mother finally said to me at that kitchen table. That some part of her had already known I was right, and the exclusion had been less about protecting the day than about avoiding having to sit with that knowledge in the room. That's a hard thing to admit. It's also, I've come to believe, a far more survivable thing to admit than the alternative my parents eventually faced anyway, just a year and a half later than it needed to arrive. Derek and I talked, more than once in the months after, about what it actually meant for me to forgive my parents, and he offered something I've held on to since. I don't think forgiveness has to mean deciding it didn't hurt, or deciding it wouldn't have been fair to stay angry longer than you did. It can just mean deciding the relationship is worth continuing to build, even with the scar still visible. I liked that distinction, because it meant I didn't have to pretend the 14 months hadn't happened in order to move forward from them. The scar is still there, faintly, in the corner of every family gathering. It just doesn't run the room anymore. It's been almost a year and a half now since that phone call on my kitchen floor, and almost as long since the counseling meeting that changed everything after it. My parents are current on both the modified mortgage and the loan I extended them, a fact my mother mentions, unprompted, almost every time we talk, as if the punctuality itself has become a form of ongoing apology. Sarah and Jason are steady, their own finances more careful now than they were during the wedding planning. A shift Sarah has told me came directly from watching what almost happened to her parents. I was there for my niece's birth this spring, in the room, holding Sarah's hand, in a moment that felt, in its own quiet way, like the wedding I'd missed finally being given back to me in a different form. I don't know exactly what the next year holds for this family, and I've stopped needing to map it out in advance the way I once tried to with spreadsheets and careful warnings. I hope, mostly, for ordinary things now, more Sunday dinners where nobody's protecting anyone else from an uncomfortable truth, more real questions asked, and real answers given room to land. I hope Sarah and Jason keep building the kind of financial honesty between themselves that took our whole family a crisis to learn. And I hope, if there's ever a next hard truth that needs saying at that kitchen table, that whoever says it isn't punished for it the way I once was, but is instead simply, finally, heard. I don't think of my parents as villains, even now. I think of them as people who loved my sister so specifically that they mistook silence for protection, and who loved me enough, underneath all of it, to finally call when they had nowhere else to turn. I think of Sarah as someone who's still learning, at 29, that love and honesty aren't actually in competition with each other, however much easier it once seemed to believe they were. I wasn't at my sister's wedding. I was, eventually, in the room for something that mattered just as much, The moment my family finally stopped protecting each other from the truth and started, slowly, telling it instead. If you've ever been excluded for telling the truth too early, I'd love to hear how it happened and what changed afterward. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.